July 15th, 1944. Dawn seeped slowly across the ruined farmlands outside Saint-Lô, a broken town that had already swallowed hundreds of tanks and thousands of men. The air was thick: wet soil, diesel fumes, scorched rubber, the faint sweetness of rotting grain mixed with the metallic bite of blood. In the half-light, an American M4 Sherman eased its way through the narrow lanes between the hedgerows. Its name, stenciled in white on the mud-streaked armor, read Grey Ghost. Inside the cramped turret, 24-year-old Corporal Robert Stanton leaned over the periscope, his breath fogging the cold glass. The tank's engine rumbled like a trapped beast below him, every shudder of the hull vibrating through his bones. He could feel his pulse hammering louder than the engine itself. His palms, slick with sweat, gripped the elevation controls as if the metal could ground his nerves. Outside, the morning fog shifted, and through it, a shape emerged. Smooth, angular, and almost elegant. A German Panther. Its 75mm L-70 gun turned slowly toward them like an executioner raising a blade. Stanton didn't need anyone to tell him what that meant. Every training manual he had ever read said the same thing. A Sherman's 75mm cannon couldn't pierce a Panther's front armor at 500 yards. It was suicide to even try. His commander shouted something through the headset, the words distorted by static and fear. Stanton barely heard him. He was already doing the math in his head. Range, angle, armor slope, velocity. Every number screamed the same verdict. No chance. And yet he didn't move. His breathing slowed. He adjusted the elevation wheel. Not much, barely the width of his thumb. 1 inch. No manual mentioned that. No instructor had ever told him to compensate like this. It was something his gut told him, a flicker of instinct somewhere between science and madness. He pulled the trigger. The cannon thundered. Smoke filled the turret, a deafening crack reverberated through the steel hull, and the Grey Ghost lurched backward from the recoil. Stanton's world shrank to the periscope, to the glowing green blur of the German tank ahead. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a flash. The Panther erupted in fire. The blast blew its turret open, flames spewing skyward. Figures clambered out, some engulfed in flame, collapsing beside the wreck. Inside the Sherman, no one spoke. Stanton stared through the smoke. His commander glanced back at him, eyes wide. The loader's mouth hung open. Nobody cheered. They simply sat there, realizing they were still alive. 1 inch, a meaningless distance in any other context, had just saved 5 men. 1 inch that wasn't in the manual, that wasn't supposed to work. But it did. Before that morning, Robert Stanton was a quiet kid nobody noticed. After it, he became the man who did the impossible. The gunner who killed a Panther head-on. He wasn't born a soldier. He came from a small town outside Concord, New Hampshire, the kind of place where the winters never ended, and the biggest news was when the snowplow broke down. His father worked at a machine shop, cutting aluminum for aircraft parts. His mother taught Sunday school. Robert wasn't strong, or loud, or fast. But he was precise. He noticed things other people ignored. The sound a motor made before it stalled. the way light bent through a piece of glass. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, he was 21. 2 months later, he enlisted. He didn't choose the airborne. He hated the idea of falling through the sky. He didn't choose the infantry either. Slogging through mud with a rifle wasn't his idea of strategy. He asked for the Armored Corps. "I want to fight inside a machine," he told the recruiter. At Fort Knox, Kentucky, he found himself among hundreds of recruits learning to operate the M4 Sherman, the most common American tank. At first, he was a loader, slamming 33-pound shells into the breech over and over until his arms felt like lead. But the instructors noticed something. The quiet New Englander could do range math faster than anyone else. When the original gunner rotated home, Stanton took his place. By 1944, he was part of the 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels. They were in England, preparing for D-Day. He spent those months asking questions no one else bothered with. Why did the Sherman's gun consistently hit low at long range? Why did some crews hit every shot while others missed under the same conditions? Why did one tank burn instantly while another survived a direct hit? His sergeant would sigh and say, "Kid, you think too damn much. Just point and shoot." But Stanton didn't stop thinking. Because deep down, he knew thinking was the only thing keeping him alive. He memorized every statistic he could find. The Sherman's 75mm gun, its 2 inches of front armor. The Panther's high-velocity gun that could punch through 6. On paper, it wasn't a fair fight. And in the field, it wasn't either. But Stanton couldn't accept that. He started carrying a small notebook, scribbling numbers between battles, sight angles, terrain slopes, humidity, barrel temperature. During downtime, he'd sit alone inside the turret, turning the elevation dials just to feel how resistance changed when the tank rocked. His crewmates teased him. "Hey, Professor," they'd say, "you writing a book?" Maybe he was. He just didn't know it yet. He wasn't trying to invent anything. He was trying to survive. Every Sherman crew in Europe knew the same cruel nickname: the Ronson. Just like the lighter. Lights every time. The Germans called it the Tommy Cooker. The implication was simple. When hit, it burned. The rumors spread through camps like ghost stories. Tales of men trapped inside burning tanks, clawing at hatches while fire filled the compartment. Stanton pretended he didn't listen, but at night, when the barracks went silent, he'd picture it. The smell of gasoline, the screams, the suffocating heat. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of burning alive. In training, the sergeant made it simple. "Boys, the Sherman's fast, reliable, easy to fix. But if you see a Panther or Tiger, don't fight it, outsmart it, flank it." Everyone nodded, but they all knew the truth. The real plan wasn't tactics, it was numbers. Build so many Shermans that it didn't matter how many were lost. For every 5 that burned, 1 would get the kill. That was the doctrine. That was the math. And Stanton hated that math. By mid-July, he was finally rolling through the French countryside. The land was a mess of bomb craters, hedgerows, and burnt farmhouses. Rain had turned the dirt to sludge. The grey ghost smelled of oil and sweat and metal. The 5 men inside barely spoke. Stanton at the gunner's seat, Sergeant Mike Harrison commanding, Quinn loading shells, Brooks driving, and Duffy on the radio. They were all thinking the same thing: don't catch fire. The closer they got to the front, the tighter Stanton's chest became. He went through the motions, checked the breech, confirmed traverse speed, readjust elevation. But his mind wouldn't stay still. He knew that if a panther saw them first, it would all be over before he even touched the trigger. The radio crackled. "Enemy armor ahead." Static hissed. The engine noise deepened as the driver slowed. Stanton wiped his palms and pressed his eye to the sight. Every vibration made the crosshairs dance. "Steady," Sergeant Harrison muttered, glancing back. "If you see him, shoot first. Don't wait for an invitation." And then, through the blur of rain-damp foliage, he saw it. A shimmer of steel, half hidden behind a hedge. He recognized that shape instantly. The flat, sloped armor, the long barrel, the low silhouette. Panther. "Target front!" Stanton shouted. 11 o'clock! Fire! The gun roared. The shell screamed across the field and struck dead center, then ricocheted off with a hollow clang. The Panther didn't even flinch. Its turret turned toward them, smooth and deliberate. Stanton had time to think one word, "Damn," before the return shot hit. The world exploded. The German shell slammed into the Sherman's right side, shredding the track and piercing the hull. Sparks filled the cabin. The loader screamed. Smoke gushed through the seams. Fire crawled along the floor like a living thing. "Out! Out! Out!" Harrison yelled. Stanton didn't hesitate. He grabbed the hatch lever, heaved it open, and pulled himself through. The heat licked at his boots as he dropped into the mud, rolling away. One by one the others followed, coughing, half blind, alive by luck. Then came the second hit. The Panther fired again, point blank. The gray ghost, their home, their armor, their world, detonated in a fireball that turned night to day. For a long time, Stanton just stood there, staring at the wreckage. His face was black with soot. His ears rang. The machine he had studied, trusted, believed in, was gone. That night, huddled under a makeshift tent, he couldn't sleep. The image replayed endlessly. The shot bouncing off, the fire rising, the sound of the explosion. His mind kept circling back to one small detail. When he had fired, the sight had jumped. Just a little, maybe an inch. He pulled his notebook from his pocket and wrote, "Panther, 700 yards, frontal hit, deflected." Then he underlined it. Below it, another line. "Sight jumped during recoil, off by 1 inch." And just like that, the obsession began. He didn't know it yet, but that 1 inch, the difference between failure and survival, was about to rewrite everything he thought he knew about war. 16 of smoke. That's where he found Sergeant Paul Franklin, the man every tank crew called when their machine went wrong. Franklin was built like an engine block, grease under his fingernails, a wrench in his hand, even when he wasn't working. He was standing over a dismantled turret mechanism when Stanton approached. "Sarge," Stanton said quietly, holding out his notebook. "Got a minute?" Franklin didn't look up. "If this is about your tank, kid, it's toast. Nothing left to fix." "Not the tank," Stanton replied. "The site." That made Franklin pause. He looked up, squinting through the smoke from his cigarette. "What about it?" "I need to know how it's calibrated. Exactly." Franklin raised an eyebrow. "Why? You planning to build a new one?" "I think it's off at long range," Stanton said, flipping open his notebook. "When we hit that Panther, we were at 700 yards. I aimed center mass, but the shell dropped. It bounced." Franklin snorted. "You shot a Panther's front plate with a 75mm pop gun, son. Of course it bounced. That's physics, not calibration. Stanton didn't blink. It wasn't just that. The sight jumped during recoil. I was off by about an inch. If I'd compensated, I think it would have gone through. That got Franklin's attention. He wiped his hands on a rag and motioned for Stanton to follow him to the back of the maintenance tent. They spent the next 3 hours surrounded by blueprints, coffee cups, and the metallic clatter of half-disassembled equipment. Franklin pulled out the factory specs for the M70 periscope, traced a finger down the margin, and frowned. "Here. Factory 0 is 500 yards, he said. That's the standard calibration." Stanton nodded slowly. "But we almost never engage at 500. In the bocage, it's 6, 7, sometimes 900. If the zero's off, you're shooting low," Franklin finished. "Even a degree at that range is a foot or more off target." He looked at Stanton. "You're saying the sight dips under recoil, then returns slightly below the original alignment?" "Exactly," Stanton said. "About 1 inch lower. I think the shock knocks the lens out of perfect parallel for just a split second." Franklin scratched his chin. "That's a hell of an observation for a gunner. You sure?" "I wrote it down the second it happened," Stanton said, holding up his notebook. "Every time the tank fired at that range, I saw the same effect. It's small, but it matters." Franklin studied the pages for a moment, then chuckled. "You've got guts, kid. Nobody talks about optics in this outfit." Stanton looked him in the eye. "I'm not trying to be smart, Sarge. I just don't want to burn again." That ended the conversation. For the rest of the afternoon, they worked in silence. Franklin fetched a half-intact periscope from a pile of scrap and mounted it on a workbench. Together they ran tests, measuring tiny changes in vertical alignment with every simulated recoil. By sunset, they had their answer. Franklin leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. "You were right. At 800 yards, the sight's zero drifts just enough to throw you low. Not by much. An inch, maybe 2. Stanton smiled faintly. "So I wasn't crazy." "No, you were just unlucky enough to notice." Franklin grabbed a pencil and scribbled a quick note on the blueprint margin. "If you want to compensate, you could pre-adjust elevation 1 inch up before firing beyond 600. Stanton nodded. "That's what I thought." "It's not standard," Franklin warned. "If the brass finds out you're tampering with optics, they'll lose their minds." Stanton closed his notebook. "I'm not planning to tell them. I'm planning to live." Franklin grinned. "Fair enough. Just don't blame me when they court-martial your ass for being right." Over the next week, Stanton quietly tested his theory. His unit received replacement tanks, fresh Shermans straight from the depot, still smelling of new paint and grease. He claimed one and christened it the New Gray Ghost. Same model, same crew. Different approach. Late at night, after everyone turned in, he'd climb into the turret with a flashlight and his notebook. He'd adjust the elevation dial 1 inch above regulation and note how far the barrel lifted. Then he'd recheck it against measured targets. Wrecked German vehicles scattered across abandoned fields. The first shots missed high. The second fell close. And by the third night he had a pattern. The inch worked. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't luck. It was math. The kind that made the difference between smoke and survival. He drew a new chart by hand, marking distances and corrections. Plus 1 inch at 700 to 800 yards, slight vertical compensation for recoil drop. No manual mentioned it, but he didn't care. He didn't need permission. He needed results. When he was done, he taped the chart beside the sight. Nobody else knew. It was his secret. his rebellion against the odds. In the mess tent, the others joked about him. "Hey, Stanton, you still writing your tank diary?" one of the drivers teased. "Gonna publish it after the war?" Stanton smiled thinly. "Only if we survive it." The men laughed, but a few looked curious. He didn't explain. He just went back to eating. Days later, his chance came. August 25th, 1944. The air was warm, the sky clear, and the fields around the town of Lamar glowed gold under the summer sun. The hedgerows were thinning now, replaced by open farmland, good ground for tanks, and deadly if you didn't see the enemy first. Stanton sat at his gunner's station, hand steady, breath even. The new gray ghost rumbled forward in formation with 3 other Shermans. The radio cracked to life. "Enemy armor grid 132, moving south." Stanton felt his heartbeat quicken. He lifted the periscope and scanned the horizon. There, a faint glint, sunlight flashing off steel. Then the shape emerged, cresting a ridge 600 meters away. A panther. Broad, angular, confident. It moved like a predator that had never known fear. "Panther, front!" Stanton called. "Range 670 yards. The gray ghost halted. The turret swung. The gun elevated. Inside the tank, everything went quiet except for the mechanical hum of the elevation motor. Stanton adjusted the sight. His inch. The invisible correction no one else believed in. He aligned the crosshairs just beneath the Panther's turret ring, the one weak point in its frontal armor. He took a slow breath. Sergeant Harrison's voice came through calm but firm. "Take the shot." Stanton exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The blast shook the world. The shell tore through the air and hit with a metallic crack that echoed across the fields. For an instant, nothing. Then the Panther erupted. Flames burst from the engine deck, the turret rocked sideways, and smoke poured from the hatches. One figure tried to climb out, engulfed in fire. The rest never moved. Inside the Sherman, the loader whooped, the commander laughed, the driver pounded the console. "You got him!" Stanton didn't move. He kept staring through the sight, watching the fire bloom. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He whispered. It worked. A second Panther appeared, farther out, moving to flank. Stanton swung the turret, recalculated the range, added the same adjustment, plus 1 inch. Fire. Another flash, another hit. The second Panther shuddered to a halt, black smoke rising from its side. The crew bailed, running for cover. The gray ghost advanced. 2 Panthers down. 0 losses. That evening, as the sun set over the quiet fields, Stanton sat beside the tank, notebook in hand. The others celebrated with cigarettes and laughter. He just stared at the wrecked German armor in the distance. It wasn't joy he felt. It was confirmation. That precision could beat power. That an inch could turn defeat into victory. Sergeant Harrison found him there, silent in the fading light. "Hell of a shot, Bob," he said, crouching beside him. "You pulled off the impossible." Stanton nodded slowly. "Wasn't luck, just 1 inch." Harrison frowned. 1 inch? Stanton showed in the notebook. Pages of calculations, range tables, and corrections. Harrison flipped through it, then looked up. "Write it clean," he said. "I want every gunner to see this." The next morning, Stanton did exactly that. He sat on an empty ammo crate and carefully copied his notes into a 1-page guide. Field adjustment for M70 sight. Recommended correction. Plus 1 inch elevation at 700 to 900 yards. Verified in live combat. He handed it to Harrison, who passed it to the unit captain. Within days, copies began circulating quietly among other crews. Some called it the Stanton correction. Others just called it the inch. Whatever the name, it spread. For the first time, tankers felt like they had a fighting chance. The Sherman hadn't changed, but the men inside had. That night, the front went quiet for the first time in weeks. No artillery echo, no incoming mortars, no distant engines crawling through the dark. Just the faint chirp of insects and the soft hum of idling machines cooling down. The new gray ghost rested at the edge of a wheat field, its armor streaked with soot, its barrel blackened from the day's fight. The smell of burnt oil still clung to everything. Stanton sat on the ground beside the tread, helmet off, knees pulled up, staring into nothing. The others were asleep or pretending to be, exhausted but alive. For the first time, they hadn't lost anyone. 2 Panthers destroyed, no casualties. But he couldn't shake the image of the German commander half out of his hatch, burning. The flash, the sound, the sudden silence. He hadn't thought of the men inside the enemy tank when he pulled the trigger. It had been numbers, adjustments, timing. But now those numbers had faces. Victory, he realized, didn't feel clean. It wasn't triumph. It was heavy, sharp, and quiet. He heard footsteps behind him. Sergeant Harrison sat down beside him with a grunt. "You did good today," he said softly. Stanton didn't answer. Harrison picked up a handful of dirt, let it sift through his fingers. "You're allowed to feel something when you win, you know." Stanton's eyes stayed on the dark horizon. "I wasn't supposed to win." "What's that supposed to mean?" "I changed the sight," Stanton said finally. "Raised it 1 inch above regulation. If I hadn't, that shot would have bounced like before. We'd be dead." Harrison studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "But we're not." Stanton opened his notebook and handed it over. "I've been tracking it since Normandy. Recoil patterns, range drop, elevation loss. I thought I was crazy until today." Harrison flipped through the cramped handwriting, range charts, and calculations, then handed it back. "Write it up. Clean, simple. I want every gunner to see it." The next morning, Stanton did as he was told. He sat on an empty ammunition crate, a pencil behind his ear, and rewrote his notes into something clear and direct. At the top, he wrote, "Field Adjustment Guide for M70 Periscope. Effective range correction, 600 to 900 yards. Beneath it, he added a single line. Recommended adjustment. Plus 1 inch elevation beyond 700 yards. Tested in live combat. Verified against Panther frontal armor." He signed it simply, R. Stanton. Sergeant Harrison passed it to the company captain, who read it, frowned, and said, "It's not standard procedure." But he didn't tear it up. He folded it and put it in his map case. 2 days later, a gunner from another platoon stopped Stanton at breakfast. "Hey, you're the guy who wrote that sight thing, right? That inch adjustment?" Stanton looked up, startled. "Who told you about that?" "Word gets around," the man said with a grin. "Tried it yesterday. Knocked out a Panther at 800. Dead-on hit." Stanton just stared at him, unsure what to say. "Appreciate it," the man added before walking off. Stanton didn't feel proud. He just felt strange. Like the secret he'd carried was no longer his. Within a week, copies of his handwritten chart appeared taped inside other turrets. Some crews scratched tiny tick marks into their elevation dials with knives. Others penciled reminders onto the gun mount itself. plus 1 inch at 700. They called it the inch. Sometimes the Stanton adjustment. Sometimes just that trick. The officers didn't endorse it, but they didn't forbid it either. Results spoke louder than rules. Over the next month, reports filtered in from across northern France. A gunner in Alpha Company used the inch during a skirmish near Nancy, hitting a Panther at over 800 yards. Another crew coordinated 2 Shermans using Stanton's correction and took down 3 German tanks in 5 minutes. The men started keeping count, not of kills, but of lives saved. Every time a tank made it home intact, they said it was 1 inch better. The army never officially recognized it. No medals, no commendations. But among the crews, it became doctrine. Quiet, unofficial, passed from man to man. The inch wasn't about pride. It was about survival. Stanton watched it all unfold with a mix of disbelief and quiet satisfaction. He hadn't set out to change anything. He had just refused to accept bad math. But now, something was shifting. The men were different. They weren't driving death traps anymore. They were driving tools. Imperfect, yes, but smarter because they understood them. Knowledge had become armor. One evening, while the unit camped near the Moselle River, Stanton sat cleaning the gun breech when a young lieutenant from another division approached. "You, Stanton?" he asked. "That's me. You really believe it? The inch?" Stanton looked up from the gun, his face smudged with oil. "Believe it? I proved it." The lieutenant handed him a folded sheet, an after-action report from a battle near Aricourt. Stanton unfolded it. 6 Shermans, 3 Panthers destroyed. No American losses. One line stood out. All crews reported pre-fire elevation compensation of plus 1 inch. All rounds on target. Stanton read it twice, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his notebook. He didn't smile. He just nodded. Because that was it. The moment the idea stopped being his and became part of the war itself. Across the front, tank crews began to treat the adjustment like a ritual. Before firing, the gunner would whisper, "Up 1," as if saying a prayer. They drew little hash marks on their gun sights. They taped charts to the turret walls. It wasn't superstition. It was data turned into faith. And for the first time, the Shermans weren't symbols of fragility. They were symbols of adaptation. They weren't built to win head-on, but now they could. Franklin, the old mechanic, stopped by their position a week later. He found Stanton sitting on the hull, cleaning the sight lens with a rag. "You started a damn movement, you know that." Stanton smirked. "I started by missing a shot." "Well, half the division's copying you now. The brass hasn't caught on, but they will, and they'll take credit." Stanton shrugged. "Let them, long as the boys get home." Franklin nodded, eyes tired but approving. "You did what the engineers couldn't. Fixed the Sherman with a pencil." As the Allied push moved east toward Belgium, the landscape changed. Gone were the claustrophobic hedgerows of Normandy. Now came open plains, broken towns, rolling hills. Perfect country for tank duels. The Panthers still fought hard, still lethal, but the edge was gone. The Shermans hit first. They hit cleaner. Every time Stanton saw a Panther burning in the distance, he thought of that inch, not as a measurement, but as a choice. A refusal to accept defeat as normal. In September 1944, the 2nd Armored Division crossed into Belgium. The men had begun to paint small symbols on their turrets. Not kill marks, but tiny white lines beside the sight. Stanton saw them everywhere. It was strange, seeing an idea turned into paint, into tradition. He never asked for recognition, but the respect was there. In nods, in small gestures, in the way other gunners would stop by his tank just to ask questions. "What's your correction for 850? Do you compensate for crosswind? Ever tried it on the move?" He answered them all. Not because he wanted to teach, but because he couldn't bear the thought of another crew dying because nobody told them. For him, the inch wasn't pride. It was debt. Every Panther that burned meant another Sherman didn't. One night, as rain pattered softly on the steel hull, Stanton sat writing in his notebook again. He wrote the same line 3 times. "Knowledge saves lives." Then he closed it, slid it into his jacket, and looked out at the dark horizon. The war wasn't over, but something fundamental had changed. The men in those steel boxes no longer felt doomed. They felt capable. They believed that skill and precision could rewrite the odds. And for the first time, it was true. The inch had become more than an adjustment. It was proof that the mind could outfight the machine. By late September 1944, France was a blur of smoke and mud in the rearview mirrors of the Allied advance. German forces were falling back toward the Siegfried Line, but they weren't beaten yet. They were learning too, countering with faster ambushes, tighter coordination, and more desperate precision. But now the Americans had something new. Not better armor, not bigger guns, but better thinking. The inch had gone viral across divisions, without orders or memos. Nobody wrote it down officially, yet every gunner seemed to know it. When Stanton's unit rolled through Belgium, the change was visible everywhere. Inside every Sherman, taped to every turret wall, were small, hand-scribbled notes, range charts, hash marks, numbers. The names differed. Stanton correction, the up one, Grey Ghost adjustment. But the meaning was the same. It wasn't superstition. It was rebellion against helplessness. In the days before the Moselle crossings, Stanton walked past a line of tanks preparing to move out. On every one he saw the same faint white tick scratched next to the elevation dial. The men didn't salute him or cheer. They didn't have to. They just nodded. The silent acknowledgement of men who understood. He was no general, no legend, just the guy who asked the right question at the right time. The 2nd Armored moved like a living machine. Every tank crew now knew their numbers by heart: range, elevation, recoil drift, wind speed. No one waited for instructions from the manuals anymore. They trusted experience, the kind written in sweat and graphite. And the Germans, who once mocked the Shermans as lighter and weaker, began to feel the sting of precision. It started with whispers in intercepted radio chatter. Panther crews complaining that American shots were getting more accurate. Impossible hits at long range, perfect strikes beneath the turret ring. The word luck disappeared from reports. Instead, they started calling it methodical. One morning, just after dawn, Stanton's column moved east near Arlon. The sky was pale blue, the kind that promised another hard day. His crew had fallen into a rhythm: jokes, coffee brewed in helmets, the quiet focus before battle. As the tanks crawled through the dew-soaked fields, the radio burst alive. "Panther platoon sighted ahead, 2,000 feet, North Ridge." Stanton felt his pulse quicken, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was readiness. "Driver, stop," he said calmly. The tank halted with a hiss of hydraulics. He set the range, adjusted his sight. That same imperceptible click upward. Elevation plus 1 inch, he murmured out of habit. The Panther appeared exactly where he expected, emerging from a tree line, moving to fire. Stanton led the target by half a degree, exhaled, and fired. The shell struck just under the turret, the same weak spot that had become his signature. The German tank erupted in smoke. The second Panther tried to turn away, but another Sherman 2 positions over hit it square in the flank, using the same correction. The engagement lasted 30 seconds. 2 enemy tanks destroyed. No Allied losses. Harrison leaned over the turret and slapped Stanton's shoulder. "That's 4 for the division this week. Guess they didn't get the memo." Stanton just nodded, marking the shot in his notebook with a small X. He no longer counted kills, only confirmations that the math still held true. In the following weeks, the results multiplied. Crews who once feared open ground began to take calculated risks. They aimed faster, hit harder, and wasted fewer rounds. The war had become a contest of decimals and decisions. The Panther was still deadlier on paper, but paper didn't breathe. Men did. And the men inside the Shermans were learning to outthink the metal. One afternoon, Stanton was called to a temporary command tent near Bastogne. The company captain wanted to see him. The tent smelled of coffee and mud, maps spread across folding tables. "Corporal Stanton," the captain said, not looking up from a chart. "I've been reading after-action reports from half a dozen units. All mention the same thing, an unofficial site correction. Yours, I assume?" Stanton stood straight. "Yes, sir. It's a field adjustment only, not regulation." The captain finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Well, regulation doesn't seem to matter when the Panthers are burning." He paused, then cracked a rare smile. "Good work, Corporal. You may have just changed armored doctrine by accident." Stanton didn't smile back. "Just tried to stay alive, sir." The captain nodded. "Sometimes that's how innovation starts." Outside, the autumn air bit cold. Leaves blew across the mud. Stanton lit a cigarette, watching the smoke drift. For the first time, he felt the strange weight of influence, the idea that one man's notes could ripple through an entire army. But with it came something darker. Each improvement meant more efficient killing. Precision wasn't just saving lives, it was ending them faster. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay under a tarpaulin beside the tank, staring up at a sliver of stars. His mind kept returning to the German crew he'd burned weeks ago. He wondered if one of them had been doing the same thing, testing, adjusting, trying to survive. War made inventors of everyone, he thought. Some just lived long enough to see the results. A few days later, a new batch of recruits arrived from the States. Fresh faces, unscarred by fire. Stanton found them gathered around their tank, struggling to make sense of the equipment. One kid, maybe 19, asked him timidly, "Hey, sir, they said you're the guy with the trick sight." Stanton shook his head. "No trick, just pay attention." He climbed up onto the turret, showed them the elevation wheel, pointed to the tiny mark beside it. "That's your life right there. 1 inch between living and burning. Don't forget it." They listened in silence. He saw the same fear he once had. The realization that the machine they were sitting in was both protection and coffin. "You learn the math," he told them. "You respect it. The tank won't save you. The numbers will." By November, the phrase, "the Stanton inch," was common slang across armored divisions. Even maintenance crews used it when calibrating turrets. "Give it the inch," they'd say, meaning fine-tune it, make it perfect. The change wasn't written in any manual, but it was alive in every conversation, every adjustment, every gunner's whispered prayer before pulling the trigger. In the field near the Siegfried Line, a correspondent for Stars and Stripes visited the 2nd Armored. He interviewed the men, asked about the Shermans, about what kept them fighting despite the odds. Someone mentioned the inch. The reporter laughed. "You mean all this fuss over an inch?" Harrison grinned. "That inch keeps us breathing." The story never made the paper. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was the secret language of survival. As winter closed in, the war grew crueler. The mud turned to ice. The air froze inside the tanks. Engines struggled to start. But the gunners had changed. They no longer fought with fear. They fought with calculation. Every shot was an equation. Every victory, a confirmation that knowledge could be as deadly as firepower. On December 10th, in a frozen Belgian valley, Stanton fired his last recorded shot of the campaign. A panther appeared briefly through the mist, its outline blurred by snow. Stanton adjusted the sight, whispering almost to himself, "Up one." The shot hit dead center, just below the turret. The explosion echoed across the hills. When it was over, he lowered the sight and exhaled. He felt nothing. No triumph. No relief. Just the quiet realization that precision had replaced emotion. The inch had become instinct. Afterward, he sat alone on the hull, watching the smoke curl into the white sky. Harrison climbed up beside him, handed him a tin cup of coffee. "You ever think about what comes after all this?" he asked. Stanton shook his head. "After this, I'm done with machines." Harrison laughed softly. "You say that now, but something tells me you'll spend the rest of your life chasing that inch." Stanton didn't answer. He just looked at the horizon, where the war was still burning, and thought how strange it was that the smallest adjustment in a scope could rewrite history. Spring 1945. The war was crawling toward its end, but no one on the front dared believe it. Town after town fell, the German lines breaking apart like glass under pressure. The 2nd Armored rolled east across the Rhine, pushing through the shattered remains of what had once been the heart of the Reich. Smoke clung to the sky for miles. The air reeked of fuel, dust, and the cold metallic smell of rain on rusted steel. By then, Stanton was no longer the nervous corporal who flinched at every shell. He moved like part of the tank itself, deliberate, calm, almost machine-like. He didn't talk much anymore. He didn't need to. His crew knew every signal, every twitch of his hand on the controls. Together, they had survived battles that should have killed them 10 times over. And through it all, that 1-inch adjustment, that tiny rebellion against the manual, had become part of how every man in the division fired. In April, near the Ruhr, a colonel from headquarters came to inspect the unit. He was clean, polished, and out of place among the mud-caked tanks. He walked around the Grey Ghost, taking notes on a clipboard, and stopped by the gun sight. "You boys been tinkering with factory calibrations?" he asked, half curious, half accusatory. Harrison smirked. "Depends what you call tinkering, sir." The colonel turned the elevation dial, noticed the faint white scratch mark beside it. "This isn't standard issue," he said. "No, sir," Harrison replied. "But it works." The colonel frowned, then straightened up. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Command's impressed." He left without another word. It was the closest thing to official recognition Stanton ever got. No medals, no mention in manuals. just quiet approval from men who had seen too many tanks burn to care about protocol. As the Germans surrendered and the guns went silent, Stanton found himself standing beside his tank, watching children play among the ruins of a small town. Their laughter echoed through the rubble like something from another world. For the first time, the silence felt real. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the notebook, the one he'd carried through every battle, its pages weathered and stained. Inside were the same numbers, charts, and equations that had once meant the difference between life and death. He flipped to the first page he'd ever written after the grey ghost burned in France. The words were still there. Sight jumped, off by 1 inch. He closed the book slowly, as if sealing away an era. Harrison came up behind him. "You keeping that?" "Yeah," Stanton said. "It's all that's left." "What are you going to do now?" Harrison asked. Stanton shrugged. "Go home. Maybe fix cars. Something that doesn't explode." The war ended, but the story didn't. The Stanton inch became legend in armored circles, not officially, never printed, but whispered among veterans, passed on like a ritual. New recruits heard about it in bars and training camps. Don't trust the factory zero. Go up one. Stanton proved it. No one could quite say who Stanton was or where he came from, but every gunner knew the myth. In post-war America, tank design changed. Engineers studied combat data from Europe, firing angles, sight errors, kill ratios. They discovered something strange. The statistics matched Stanton's field corrections almost exactly. They adjusted the new optical systems to account for recoil drop, an invisible tribute to a corporal whose name they didn't even know. Meanwhile, back in New Hampshire, Robert Stanton lived quietly. He found work repairing farm machinery. Sometimes he'd pause in his workshop, watching the gears turn, the pistons align, the tolerances so small that an error the width of a matchstick could ruin the whole system. He'd smile a little at that. The poetry of precision. Neighbors said he rarely talked about the war. When they asked if he'd killed anyone, he always gave the same answer. "I shot at steel, not people." Years later, long after the newsreels had faded and the Shermans were museum pieces, a young historian tracked him down for an interview. The man brought with him a tattered army manual, open to the section on sight calibration. At the bottom of the page, in small print, it read, "Recoil compensation, minor elevation variance, approximately 1 inch at 700 plus yards. Should be considered during long-range engagement." "Did you know about this?" the historian asked. Stanton laughed quietly. "They finally wrote it down, huh?" The historian smiled. "They say you came up with it." "I didn't come up with anything," Stanton said. "I just stopped missing." The interviewer pressed on. "Do you think that inch really made a difference?" Stanton's gaze drifted to the fields outside. Green now, alive. "It made all the difference," he said softly. "Not because of what it hit, but because it meant we learned. We adapted. That's how we win. Not with luck, not with miracles, but with thinking. 1 inch at a time." The historian wrote the quote down. Years later, it appeared on a bronze plaque beneath a restored Sherman tank in a museum exhibit titled, "Brains Behind the Steel, The American Gunner's War." The plaque didn't mention his full story, just the line, "He changed the odds by 1 inch." Visitors walked past without knowing the man behind it. a quiet machinist from New Hampshire who once refused to accept the math of defeat. And in that anonymity was something profoundly American. The idea that progress isn't loud, that it doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it's born in a muddy field, in the hands of a young man who looks at a broken site and says, "What if I'm just 1 inch off?" Because that's how wars are won. Not only with factories and firepower, but with the smallest adjustments made by men who refuse to quit. The Panther had been the symbol of German perfection. The Sherman, the symbol of American imperfection. But in the end, the war proved something deeper. Perfection doesn't win wars. Adaptation does. The Panther was built to dominate. The Sherman was built to improve. And when that inch became a doctrine, when the mind behind the gun turned data into survival, it showed the world what made America unstoppable. Not just courage, not just numbers, but curiosity, innovation, and the refusal to die ignorant. Inch by inch, they turned weakness into strength, and knowledge into victory. The grey ghost never came home. It still lies somewhere in the mud of Normandy, its metal bones rusting beneath the grass. But its legacy, that invisible mark scratched beside a sight dial, lived on. Not as a legend of luck, but as proof that precision can be power. That's where the war truly shifted. Not in the skies over Berlin, or in the ruins of cities, but inside the steel shell of a tank, in the hands of a single American gunner who refused to accept failure as fact. 1 inch. The smallest distance. The greatest difference.